All right, so this week is the opening to the question of human nature. So that is one of the fundamental questions in philosophy. It's one of the fundamental questions that human beings have been asking themselves since human beings really began to think and to consider themselves and to consider their state. So when looking at this question of human nature, we're going to do so in quite a few different ways, through quite a few different authors, but we're going to begin from ancient sources, and it's appropriate to begin there because this is where the first conceptions of human nature came from. And so there's a number of different readings, 5 different readings, all very short, that you're going over. And the first one is biblical, so Genesis. And so this is, for those that are Christian or Jewish or Islamic, a foundational narrative, a foundational story about human beings. And what do we find? We find that human beings are made and formed in the image of God. And this formation, so there's something divine about us, distinguishes us from nature. So we're not simply part of nature, even though we were kind of created from dust. There's also something unique about us. So we're part of the continuum, but also have a very special place in the continuum. Unlike anything else in nature, we are formed in the image and likeness of God. And so that sense that there is something divine about our nature, something spiritual, is very important to notice. Now when we talk about how human beings have a special place in nature, what we get from this part of Genesis is that the point, or the proper order when it comes to the world, is that human beings rule over the natural world. Part of the divine plan, part of our being made in the image and likeness of God, is to rule over it, to subdue the natural world. And so we are forming part of the hierarchy. In terms of nature, we are at the height of the hierarchy. We're at the top of the hierarchy. We're meant to tame it. We're meant to divide it. We're meant to categorize the world. We're meant to help it operate efficiently and effectively. So anyway, so that's what you get, a sense that human beings are divine, and that even though human beings are part of a natural order, the part we are in is meant to rule over, and that is not violent, it's not bad, it's part of a hierarchy instituted by God. Now, when you think about what questions would come out of this, many people would criticize this part of the Genesis story today, in the sense they'd say, look, the problem is that it elevates humanity above nature. Human beings are portrayed as special, as unique, as different, as superior, and nature is inferior, nature is to be used, nature doesn't have an independence of its own or a value of its own. And so particularly like environmentalists will say this is part of the problem. This is one of the reasons we've had environmental destruction, is because of texts like this where human beings think they're meant to be in control. Now, you can ask, is this in keeping with the biblical narrative? Is environmental degradation, is environmental abuse consistent with the biblical narrative? Or is that something different? Are we meant to rule over it and subdue it? Or are we meant to abuse it? Are we meant to be shepherds? Or are we meant to simply be takers? Okay, the next story is the story of Gilgamesh. And so, again, a very ancient story. And it's important to understand that Gilgamesh is a human ideal. But this means he's not only kind of different in kind, but he's different in degree from other humans. So he is kind of like the Jesus of that ancient world. He is what we're meant to be. The perfection of the human being. And the human being, what we find, is that at least to some degree, it's created from the substance of the divine. There's something more than human in the human. And so we're going beyond ourselves to something more. We're not simply finite creatures. There's more to us. There's the divine within us. And so certainly there is a great similarity between Gilgamesh and Genesis in that regard, in the sense that they both share an image of human nature as something divine. So the one who's not human is one who is still purely natural, is one who is still purely animal. And this is where we get the kind of the Enkindu. So there's a split between human and nature. And it's not only that there's a split. In Genesis, human beings rule over. In the Gilgamesh story, there is a sense of tension. There's a sense of confrontation. There's a sense of conflict that you don't get in the Genesis story. And Kindu, for example, who personifies nature, helps the creatures escape the human traps. And when he becomes humans, the animals now flee. Again, there's a sense of, look, there is this distrust, there is this tension. And so, like Genesis, there's a sense that human beings are divine. There's something divine about us. But what is different is this notion that there's a tension between the different realms. Now, I think it'd be interesting if you want to kind of talk about the story and think about it. Does the Gilgamesh story represent, for example, the relationship between human beings and nature after the fall? So in Genesis, before the fall, there's this kind of harmony, nature and human beings working together, with nature being submissive and being obedient to human beings. But after the fall, is that when the tension comes in? Is that where the abuse comes in? And perhaps you could read the Gilgamesh story as a story of what the human-nature relationship is after the fall. Okay, so both of those stories, again, human and divine connecting, and they tell a story about the relationship between nature and humanity, and not necessarily the same story. When we get to Theophanes, he's going to say something different. He is going to say that the divine is totally different than mortals. So, we are not divine. Our nature is not to be like the gods. We don't participate, we don't share in that nature, we're not made in that image and likeness. And so that's a fundamentally different perspective to take on human nature. Whereas Gilgamesh and Genesis say we are part of the divine, Theophanes says no. They are in one realm, they are different, they are nothing like us, and we are in a different realm. We have our origin in air and earth and water, and we return to it. So in other words, human beings are thoroughly material. We are just physical stuff. And that is interesting, because that is very much like many people would associate today. There's many people that would think that human beings are purely physical, that we don't have spiritual stuff in us, there's nothing divine about us. So Theophanes may represent that image of the human nature that is perhaps more prevalent today than it is back when Theophanes wrote. And it's also interesting that Theophanes explains why it is that human beings would think that they're made in the image and likeness of gods. And he says, the error is that we tend to think of the highest in terms like ourselves. So we tend to imagine the divine, the God, as something that looks like us, thinks like us. So what Theophanes would say, it's not so much that we're made in the image and likeness of God, it's that Gilgamesh and Genesis make God in the image of us. And you can ask yourself, do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that? Okay, you go to Plato and Pythagoras, and this view is going to be, again, fundamentally different than Theophanes. Now, they're not explicitly talking about us made in the image and likeness of God in this story, but where they are fundamentally different is that they say the human essence, the truest part of ourselves, is our soul, our rational thinking soul. We are most fundamentally an immaterial soul. We are not physical stuff in our most basic being. We are a soul, a thinking being, a mind that is within a body. But we're not purely material, because once the material is dead, once our body dies, our soul goes to a different realm. And that is the nature of a soul, to go to that which is intellectual, that which is invisible. And you get an image of the body that is very dark. The image is that of a prison, and that we're kind of chained to the body. We're stuck in the body. Our goal in life is to free ourselves from our body. And this has real kind of impacts. All these perspectives on human nature have real impacts, in terms of how we think about how we go about the world. If you think who we really are is not of this world, that can impact what we do in this life. If we think all we are is physical, Some people would take that to be wonderful. We can embrace our nature, we can live for the moment. Others would find that depressing in the sense that we're just physical stuff that exists for a moment and then is gone, is dissipated. And so you've got to ask yourself, between this classical opposition, Plato and Pythagoras, the kind of the dualistic, we are mind and matter, spirit, soul, and physical body, but our truest self is our soul, versus the materialistic perspective of something like Xenophanes. Which one do you agree with? Which one do we partake of? And then finally, Hesiod. Hesiod is interesting because he provides perspective of human existence and human nature, which is not stable. He's not saying we are one single thing. He is saying that essentially we develop. So he tells a story, he tells a myth. In the first generation, you've got the golden generation. They're blessed, the perfect harmony with nature. Everything is easy, everything is wonderful, everything is beautiful. It is the Garden of Eden. So in that vision of human nature, everything is wonderful. Life is happy. There are no trials, there are no tribulations. But then the next generation comes about, and it's called the silver generation. He says, look, it's far worse. There's a long period of maturity. You're childish. You're not able to think properly. There's a lot of fighting. There's kind of a disrespect for gods and hierarchies. There's a selfishness. And so this kind of chaotic, me first, lack of perspective type of generation is what follows. So people in that generation have a different kind, of a different nature, you might say, than people of the first, golden generation. Then you get the third generation, the bronze generation. And here, it's a kind of a dark, bleak view, a very physical view, a very confrontational view, kind of a raw strength and brutality, pure physical type of existence, and hard labor. And so people in that generation are just tied to the here and now. They're getting through the day. They're surviving, you might say. There's nothing uplifting. There's nothing spiritual. And the fourth generation is the heroic generation. And here you get an image where there is obviously heroism. There's a kind of a nobler character, a better character. You get this sense that human being is partly human, partly divine. So again, there's that connection with the gods. And so this is going to be, human beings in this generation are again going to be of a different kind, of a different nature than that of the previous generations. And finally, Hesiod goes to his present contemporary generation. And he says, look, there is a great deal of suffering, there's a great deal of toil, there's a great deal of conflict and confrontation. And now there's some good amidst the hardship, but it is one where we've lost that kind of that beautiful beginning. And you see this many times in terms of interpretations of human life, that you have the ancient, the first, the original, as blessed, as perfect. Many people would say that's naive and that's romantic and that's idealistic. But it is interesting to think that many people think that their generation is the one that has fallen. Their generation is the one that is corrupted. Is that true? Perhaps. But it is kind of a reoccurring motif. And when we talk about human nature, again, with Hesiod you get the sense that it's mobile, that it's changing, that it's influenced by the environment, that we can't talk about human nature as just this one thing that always exists the same and forevermore. And so again, you can kind of connect that to whether or not you agree. Do you agree that there is a kind of a stable human nature, or do you agree that, or do you think that it changes? Or perhaps you do some kind of combination of both. Maybe you say, look, we are an immaterial soul, that is our fundamental essence, but how we approach that soul, how we treat that soul, how we think about that soul, differs based upon our time. Perhaps you say, yeah, our fundamental nature is to be divine, but our awareness of that divinity, our embodiment of that divinity, our living out up to that divinity changes as we develop and as different ideas and as different generations come about. Okay, and so that essentially is a brief, kind of a broad overview of some of the different perspectives the ancient had on human nature, and I look forward to getting your perspective as to what you agree with or what you have questions with about that perspective.